The people from Turkey speak Turkish, and the people from Korea speak Korean. Those from Russia speak Russian, and those from France speak French. But what language do the people from India speak? Indians speak 122 major languages and around 1,599 minor languages and dialects. There is perhaps no other debate in independent India that is as old and contentious as the debate around having a national language or Rashtra Bhasha. Most of the time, this debate revolves around the question of language imposition and to what extent it is justified or desirable for national unity. Today, we want to question the assumption that an unified common language is needed for national unity. If yes, why is it needed? For nation building, economic progress, easier communication, better administration, or international prestige? We have with us a panel of highly eminent experts who can shed new light on this matter and help us in developing a nuanced understanding of this age-old national debate. Does India need a national language? We have with us Dr. Mithilesh Jha, Assistant Professor at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Guwahati. We have Dr. Rita Kothari, Professor of English at Ashoka University, multilingual scholar, author, and translator. We have Dr. Ajay Gudavarthi, Associate Professor in Political Science at Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We have Cynthia Stephen, independent researcher, journalist, gender and development policy analyst, and author. And we have Drs. Sumant Raman, television anchor, political analyst, and commentator, doctor and healthcare IT professional. Welcome all of you to Argumentative Indians. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of confusion around whether or not Hindi has been granted an official status in the Constitution. So let's first start with what does the Constitution say on the subject of national language or official language? Can I invite you, Dr. Gudavarthi?
The Constitution and the Constituent Assembly debate was very clear on the fact that India only has an official language and not a national language. And the choice was English as an official language, and therefore we had the 8th schedule, which therefore had 22 other language being elevated to the status of official languages. So as such, India does not, constitutionally speaking, have anything called a national language. And what this led to, I mean, just to add a point, because you have just raised a question of information, is that in essence, it led to a kind of a Chaturvarna kind of a hierarchy of 4 languages. You had a Sanskrit, which was, has an identity of a civilizational language. Then you had English, then you had Hindi, then you had the scheduled languages, and then the rest, which are non-scheduled, which are known to different as dialects, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So was it purposeful that we did not have a national language, and the Constitution also does not say that there is no national language? I think that's what's led to a lot of confusion. I don't know if you want to add on to that point, Dr. Gudavarthi.
Yeah, yes, that's an interesting, the way they resolved. There was a moment in a Constituent Assembly debate that there was this temptation of even Nehru, for instance, wanted Hindi to be declared as the national language. So I would argue, Yajur, personally, that for any nation, I think having a common language is always an advantage. I give you my own experience. Recently, I was in Kerala for a seminar at a university, and there was a caretaker at the guest house who could speak neither Hindi nor English. And there is a strange sense of discomfort in your own nation that you face when you begin to feel the others are strangers and you cannot really communicate well. We have to communicate through sign languages. To that extent, I would say that India would have done well in terms of having a common language. But as you said, the idea of the national is linked to the idea of nation, that there has to be a sense of belonging. So I would have ideally thought that Indian constitution makers could have gone for a national language, which kind of would bring some kind of a common lingo in terms of communication. But they could have, but the problem precisely was that it turned out to be, in terms of self-perception of the rest of the areas in India, as some kind of Hindi chauvinism, that it was being imposed. Perhaps they could have done something of a kind of having a mandatory that the Hindi heartland spoke some non-Hindi language of East, either Bengali or Odia or South Malayalam or Telugu or Marathi. I think that would have settled, going out of regional chauvinism on one hand and national Hindi chauvinism. What in India today we have ended up because of this kind of, as you said, is neither declaring national nor declaring that we do not have a national, is that on one hand we have stuck and remained with Hindi chauvinism. On the other, we have sons of soil kind of a movement of regional chauvinism. So they're competing chauvinisms, which are neither of it is healthy for democracy.
Thank you, sir. So it's actually a common experience that people share, that they feel a bit strange that they're in their own nation. Sometimes they struggle to communicate of the same nation. But why do we think that people often of one nation should have a common language? Where did even thought originate from? Maybe I can invite Dr. Kothari. Ma'am, people who argue for unilingual policies or one nation, one language, aren't they simply trying to mimic the European model of a nation state where it is predicated on the homogeneity, linguistic homogeneity of the people? Like, isn't this a very European idea that people should have a common language in a common country?
I entirely agree. I think this idea of one nation, one language is, I've written about this in a Kafila article. There was, I think, this particular moment, I can't remember which year, when I think MLAs and other representatives of the state were told to use only Hindi on Twitter. And in response to that, I wrote a piece which I called Videshi Nationalism. That in this gesture, in fact, I think there is a kind of a European modular nation anxiety here, thinking that we need to have a national language. I think that we need to disentangle a common language and national language. A common language can emerge organically also. It can emerge out of the intensity of vehicular languages in India. And I don't think we should undermine their role at all. Hindi and English, sometimes together, sometimes one against the other, do function very often as vehicular languages. And there's a certain day-to-day purpose by which you sort of get by. And I think those serve, they mimic quite often the role of a common language. It's true that we don't have a national language, but I agree with you that I don't think we need a national language. We don't need to mimic that model at all.
Thank you. But can you elaborate a little bit more on the common language and the national language distinction? How would we draw, like, people who insist on national language, they don't ask others to forget about their local languages. The idea is that everybody should have a common language. And then it usually goes down the problem of which language should become the common language.
Yeah, so I think the distinction that I was trying to make is to say that there are sometimes languages that we come to share through a certain journey, whether that journey is through Bollywood, or it is through traveling by railways, or it is through forms of administration, travel, migration, living outside your state. And sometimes those languages or certain codes that you come to share can emerge organically. But national language would be a language by state legislation. It is not emerging from the ground as something that people have come to kind of use. So I think that distinction is a very important one to make, especially in a country like India, that I think we have sometimes these languages such as a certain Bolchal ki Hindi, not the kind of Sanskritic textbook Hindi that the state was propagating, but a certain Bolchal ki Hindi has come to sometimes perform the role of a common language in many parts of India. And when that doesn't happen, if you're in urban centers, sometimes English performs that role. Together, I think they come to create, they try and fill certain gaps. Now, so we don't have a perfect model here, but I think we do have some kind of a model here, and it's an interesting one. Whereas the national language would be hegemonic. I mean, what kind of national language can we introduce that would be acceptable to everybody. Look at the fractious history that Professor Gudavarti also already drew our attention to. So I believe that we need to shed this anxiety.
So it's sort of the Nehruvian policy where that a common language should evolve over time. It should emerge through our own over time, through our interaction, instead of being imposed from top down.
Right. And not one, it may be a couple, it may be more.
Got it. Let me bring in Dr. Jha. So, but the state has to function in some language, and a lot of people say that we even if people evolve a common language, the state has to decide which language is it going to function in, and the choice of the state's language has important repercussions. People have to interact with the polity, and that sort of determines how franchised or disenfranchised they are. So, do you think that a common language is needed for administrative purposes across India?
Yeah, thank you, Yajur. That's a good question. And as other panelists have argued before me, that, when you create a national identity, you want to develop a sense of belongingness, a kind of, identity to which you can all associate. So there is, natural that people will look for one such language. So European model you have referred to was about, one people, one nation, one language, one history, and so on. Now, considering the making of India and imagination of Indian nationhood, it is really a challenge to have one such language which can, be helpful to communicate throughout the length and breadth of the country. So during the anti-colonial struggle, you have a nationalist elite using English language as the vehicle of communication and making their claim against the colonial government. In post-independent India and throughout that anti-colonial struggle, also you have also attempt to make, say, Hindi or Hindustani as national language for the India. But considering its diversity and plurality, and if you look at, say, Constituent Assembly debates and post-independent politics in India, there are genuine concern about creating one singular language, especially from the state, as the vehicle for communication across the length and breadth. Now, the other point which you have asked, that when a state use a particular language and not having that language or access to language, how does it affect your democratic participation? I mean, that's the thing which we scholars also need to talk about. Indian democracy, for example, it cannot be explained or understood either through Hindi or through English. There are, as Rita Kothari has argued in her edited volume, about multilingualism. This multilinguality needs to be understood, and some of these ideas about, say, democracy, democratic participation, majority of the Indian people understand, articulate, and use in their vernacular, or you call it Bhasha speech. Now, in various states or provinces in India, you have, the similar tension about within a province, one language becoming a dominant language, and the other language or the speakers of other language may feel, alienated. That needs to be addressed. So that's the part of, as I say, a larger democratic struggle in India. The challenges or the fault lines of those struggles can be understood through the various Bhasha spheres. And similarly, talking about the imagination of Indian or Indian nationhood, you cannot understand those complexities or challenges either through Hindi or English or any kind of other singular language. It has to have recognition or acknowledgement of not just the diversity, but also the celebration of those diversity. And that has to be the basis of Indian imagination of nationhood and also about democracy also about participation. So various linguistic movements can be understood as part of that democratic struggle within Indian nation and nationhood as well.
Thank you. Let me bring in Dr. Raman. Dr. Raman, there is a view fairly widespread in India that putting English at that pedestal of official language or an administrative language is embarrassing for us at an international level. It sort of shows that we have not decolonized. And as the Home Minister Amit Shah said, I think 2 years ago, that it reflects a slave mentality, that we feel that speaking in the language of the colonizer puts it at an elevated status. So what is your view on this? Do you see the need? A lot of people think that a native Indian language should be encouraged to even gradually replace English.
Okay, so first of all, the entire issue has to do a lot more with identity as much as it is with merely the language. So do we need a national language? Well, I don't see how it's going to dramatically alter things, especially because of the fact that we come from such diverse backgrounds, speaking multitudes of languages at this point of time. Now, the big advantage that English has is it is neither my language nor your language. So we don't have to fight with each other, because if you brought in, say, Hindi, which is spoken by a sizable number of people in this country, and you impose it on me in Tamil Nadu, then I am not willing to accept that, or in the Northeast, or in various other parts of the country. Therefore, if a third entity like English, and there is a very good reason, very many good reasons for learning English, as for educational reasons, it is the most spoken language in the world from a business perspective, from an employment perspective, and so on. So therefore, if at all there has to be a lingua franca for the country, there is more than enough logical reasons for that to be English. Let me give you an example of Singapore. Now, according to the Constitution of Singapore, their national language is Malay. That is what the Constitution said. And you know why it said it? It said it because the people of Malay descent were the original sort of inhabitants of Singapore. So therefore, they had Malay as their national language. And then they figured out that with the ethnic diversity in Singapore, and the fact that the majority of people were not Malays over a period of time, they then said, let's move to this 4-language policy, where English became the medium of instruction in schools across Singapore. Second language is compulsory. Very often, students would take if they were Malays, they would take Malay as the language. If they were Chinese, they would take Mandarin. If they were Tamils, they would take Tamil, and so on. So, and then they had 4 official languages. But if you go into the Constitution, the national language is Malay, but Malay does not enjoy any status, any special status over the other languages. So this whole argument that Hindi could even attempt to be made a national language is a non-starter, because many states will not accept it. Why has Hindi evolved to be the most spoken language in the country? It is not only part of a natural process. It is also because from the time of independence, Hindi has been taught very often as a compulsory subject in schools, as a second language or as a third language. Whereas many of the regional languages were not taught outside their regions in schools. So therefore, Hindi enjoyed that advantage. And then we are using that advantage now to say, oh, more people speak Hindi, so let Hindi be the national language. It's a complete non-starter.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the Singapore example. So it's well known, Lee Kuan Yew, although Malay was made a national language, but lingua franca in Singapore remains English, which I think he believed that it has to be equidistant from all the cultural groups. But at the same time, Singapore is not really an example of a place which has emerged out of the colonial influence. Singapore seems to embrace its colonial period. They don't seem to have this almost celebrated. That's not the way the colonization is remembered in India. So for us, and in India, especially a nation which has given birth to, I'm just being the devil's advocate, bringing out the nationalistic view. India has given birth to thousands of languages, and some of the world's most ancient languages. Now it does become embarrassing interacting with Europeans and saying that, oh, our lingua franca is one of the European languages, because 1.3 billion people couldn't come up with any language to come have our own lingua franca.
No, I think that, look, you want to have a national language. I have no problem with that. As long as it is not one of the languages that is currently being spoken. Now, how practical is that? Let's figure it out separately. But the point is, when you try to impose your language on me, I'm sorry, that is simply not acceptable. And this is where the seeds of separatism are actually sown. I can tell you from in my home state, originally one of the causes of the Dravida Nadu concept, or the separate statehood for Tamil Nadu, which was espoused by the DMK, the current ruling party, in its original early years, and its predecessor, the DK, at one point espoused Dravida Nadu. And a lot of the reason for that, for espousing Dravida Nadu, was the imposition or perceived imposition of Hindi. So you have to understand that if we say that any language, any existing language, whether it is Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, Tamil, any language, if you want to impose it on a people who do not naturally speak that language, it will be resisted. That is why I said, you want a national language, feel free to have one, but get us a new one. We cannot have any of the existing languages as the national language, period. Unless, of course, it's English, which is the obvious choice. Because it's nobody's language. It's not your language, not my language.
Understood. I do want to come back to that. That's an interesting proposition you've made there. But let me bring in Ms. Stephen. I want to go back to the main question, Ms. Stephen. Do you think homogeneity of language is required for national unity? Because most of the times people make an argument, and that was also made by, it's not Amit Shah made it recently, but it's been made before by Sardar Patel, by Mahatma Gandhi himself, that for national unity, India needs to have homogeneity of language, a common language. What is your view on that? Is assimilation required for integration?
See, it's interesting that you mentioned that Sardar Patel was also in favor of a national language, but everybody knows Sardar Patel as the one who implemented the linguistic states, the issue of linguistic states in our country. And in that, I think our founding fathers were pragmatic, because our country is not, to call India a nation is not exactly correct, because we are not just a nation. We are a collection of very large numbers of nations, in the sense that if you look at the classical definition of what a nation is, if you look at the dictionary, it will tell you that a nation is united by language. So that is why we have the Odia speaking Odisha and Odia, and their state is called Odisha also. Similarly, we have Tamil Nadu, and there's people there speak Tamil, and their state is called Tamil Nadu. We have Maharashtrians speaking Marathi, and their state, the name of the state and the name of their language is closely linked. So, even so, with Gujarati. You see, so the identity of the majority of that population of that particular region, of that particular nation, that language-speaking nation, is involved. Okay, and that is one. The second thing is that India, at the time of independence, had over 500 little princely states. Not just, it was not just one large, apart from the areas ruled by the British Raj, there were 500 odd little states. I myself grew up in a little state called Sandur in the middle of Bellary district, where the rulers were Marathi. And the erstwhile rulers were Marathi, and I was a little girl. And there's a large population of Marathis in that state, in that little state of Sandur. So, and it was the heart of Bellary district, and which Bellary district itself is a very linguistically diverse. Bangalore, for instance, was recently pointed out that more than 271 native languages are spoken in Bangalore. So it is probably the most linguistically diverse city in the country, if not the world. Of course, everybody knows about New York being, the Big Apple, having a lot of diversity. So therefore, I would say that the founding fathers did what was best. Give language its due space by having provinces with the majority language there. And therefore, in the kind of identity that we are, I think we have to accept that we are a multicultural, multilinguistic collection, conglomeration first. For instance, even in my home state, Karnataka, apart from Kannada, we have other native dialects. We have Kodava spoken in the, by the Kodava people, the Kurgi people, in Coorg district. We have Tulu widely spoken along the coast. We have Konkani, two versions of Konkani, in fact. And, we have another language called Tigla, which is spoken in southern. All these are dialects without a script. But large numbers, thousands and thousands, even lakhs of people speak this. They even have their own literatures. There's a language called Beri in coastal Karnataka. And so there's a Beri, Sahitya Academy. There's a Tulu Sahitya Academy. So in one state, in Karnataka state, which is known to have a very large population of Kannada-speaking people. And so this is the dilemma. How do you then talk about a so-called national language? I think what we are doing now is a good example. And to talk about embarrassment in the use of English, I'm sorry, I don't agree at all. I think the reason India does very well, Indians do very well across the world, is because they have access to good quality English being taught to them, and it is used widely in education, particularly technical education. And because it is also the language of business, trade, and commerce, I think we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot if we move away from English, from using English. This is a very pragmatic thing. Apart from all the emotions, imagine what the Assamese would think. And then we have another state called Assam, which is known by its own language. The name of its language and the name of the state are the same. Ahom, So I think we have to really be pragmatic. Anyone who insists that our identity is locked up with a national language doesn't understand what India is really all about.
Thank you. So you talked about identity, right? And that's usually the argument when people argue against language imposition, because language is not just a means of communication; it embodies an entire cultural identity. And when you deprive people of that by imposing a different language, it has longer term implications for how confident they are as individuals. And we've seen that play out across the northern Hindi belt, where Hindi was imposed on pretty much, and what that did to identity of people speaking different dialects. But even the phenomenon, what is being contested at a national level, has already played out at the state level, and we have adapted to it. So you talked about Karnataka. Let's focus on Karnataka. You said there are many languages there, Tulu, Konkani, Kodava. And because of the imposition of Kannada as the official language, so they did make Kannada the official language of the state. And languages like Tulu and others have even lost their script now. So that people seem to have adapted now, right? And they do maintain their Tulu, but they are also accepting Kannada for official purposes, administrative purposes. Can you share some more insight on that, how that has played out at the state level?
Yeah, no. There was no imposition of Kannada at all. Kannada was already the administrative language of the state of Mysore. So it wasn't too difficult. There was no imposition at all. One. Secondly, no, Konkani or Tulu did not lose any script because they don't have scripts. They're spoken dialects. So they do use the Kannada script. And one section of Konkani uses the Devanagari script. Another set of people use Konkani with the English script, Roman script, that is. So script is a different issue. The language, the usage of the language, the popularity of the language grows with the people. And I don't think there is any attempt to impose Kannada per se. As a matter of fact, there is a good reason to say that Kannada is at a disadvantage in many ways in Karnataka because of the very diverse population we have, and we often have Kannada enthusiasts, protesting about the lack of usage of Kannada in signage and in the titles of movies and things like that. And I sympathize with that. I myself, though I am not a native, it is not my mother tongue. I speak other languages at home. It is my native language. It is my cultural identity to Kannada. I speak it well. That it's important for.
You got muted for a moment.
Yeah. So Kannada is actually most regional languages are have their back to the wall, and their native speakers try their best. For Tamil Nadu is a good example. Telugu in Tamil in Andhra Pradesh also, the government has passed an order that government schools should go into the English medium. So I'm sure that the Telugu enthusiasts will be up in arms about it, even though they appreciate the usage of in the teaching of English in schools. So there are two aspects. One is identity, the other is being pragmatic and how you're going to use it for your life and career or livelihood. So we cannot mix up the two; both go hand in hand.
Sure, but just to clarify this further, if you are, let's say, if your mother tongue is Tulu, or if it's Kodova, or like in case of Bihar, it's like Maithili, to interact with the state or for economic purposes, you do use a tongue which is not your mother tongue. Where in one case it's Kannada, in the another case it's Hindi proper. So there is already that process going on at a state level, which is being sort of pushed at a national level. So is it okay for it to happen at a state level where we have done this compromise? Okay, 22 of the hundreds of languages have been given that official status. Now let's work with these. But any more shrinking is something that we oppose to. I don't know, anybody can answer that, whoever wants to talk. Dr. Jha wants.
Okay, may I come in? Yeah.
Yes, please.
So, yeah, that's a great question, actually, Yajur. See, I did research about Maithili and the way they negotiate with official language in the state of Bihar. So, this feeling of not being adequately recognized or giving access to the the official or the state promoted events or various ways through which modern Indian languages develop are denied to those languages which are not being recognized by the state or by the constitution. So not just Tulu land or the Tulu in Tamil Nadu, but Bodos in Assam, for example, or Konkani against Marathi, for example, Maithili in Bihar, Bhojpuri in northern India within Hindi heartland, are actually making a statement about their own distinct identity, and they demand the state to recognize them. So denying those recognition are seen as a kind of not getting adequate recognition or acknowledgement by the state. Different linguistic communities who are struggling for such recognition are, making their protest or discomfort in a distinct way. So Tulu language or Bodo, Konkani, Maithili are examples of such different ways of expressing those discomfort. And it also says about the larger thing, which is the question of national language or official language. Now, one of the central objective of having a national language is to unify the people, to have a sense of belonging in terms of psychologically and emotionally bringing people together. And all of the panel members today would agree that India, in that sense, is not like a homogeneous nation state like in Europe. You have the multiplicity of language. Plurality is the part of life. So what I would argue that, having knowledge of more than one language is not a problem. It should be seen as something which, so we are bilingual, trilingual people in general. So we negotiate, and code switching, switching from one language to other is not a problem. So problem comes when you try to homogenize or try to make one language as the official or the national language. So if you look at, say, chapter 17 of Indian Constitution, it talks about official language of the union. It talks about official language of the state, but it also talks about how a state will negotiate with the regional languages, not recognized or unscheduled languages. They have substantial number of speakers. So what they want is the recognition that their language, their script, their culture, their tradition matter. And being Indian does not mean they should, forget their own language, their own script. So in India, the question of plurality and diversity should not be replaced with singularity or homogeneity. And on that point, I see nation and nation state as a political project. No matter how much you try to define it in terms of language or culture or religion or any other forms of identity, at the end of the day, billions of people or millions of people want to live together with a certain imagination of the polity. And in India, that polity is, I think, well envisioned in the preamble to the Indian Constitution. Now, how different languages articulate, and I think, going back to the question of democracy, getting adequate recognition by the state, or not feeling alienated or discriminated by the state and its policies, is to look at them in the larger process of democratization, where these novel ideas in the preamble are articulated. So, just having different language does not disqualify us for being a nation. We can be a nation, we can have a sense of belongingness or a particular idea of India, despite of diversity or celebration of diversity in terms of language, culture, and identity. And Indian nationhood is all about that.
Yeah. So in the last 75 years, that sense of nationhood has worked really well, despite having different languages. We don't really need homogeneity of language. Yes, Dr. Gudavarti, please.
Yeah, I think also that we cannot frame the entire question of language only exclusively in terms of plurality and diversity. There are also complex linkages to caste and class relations. When English was spoken, that the fact that caste Hindu, middle class spoke English gave them an additional advantage of cultural capital. So there was also class mobility. That is the reason today the Dalits and Bahujans, which constitute the majority of Indian population, up to 75%, are demanding English education. The fact that Ms. Stephen referred to, that Andhra Pradesh government recently said that all government schools will teach exclusively in English medium. Because English as a language, so language is not merely in terms of plurality. It has to do with questions of dignity. It has to do with questions of mobility. It has to do with questions of opportunity. Therefore, regional languages themselves, it's not merely national language and official language and English, that many of the Dalit, Bahujan, subaltern castes are today rejecting regional languages, that they do not want to be educated exclusively in mother tongue because these languages remind them of their caste status. So language also has very complex linkages to their social status. So questions of dignity are very important. That's the reason, in Madhya Pradesh, they celebrated goddess of English. There's actually a temple that was inaugurated as called the Immaculate Goddess of English, because English is seen as an escape from this kind of indignities that are imposed through caste order. So we'll have to frame the question of language also in terms of its linkages to class and caste. On the other hand, there are educationists like Krishna Kumar, Anil Sadgopal, and others who have been arguing that we need to retain mother tongue because mother tongue gives certain kind of an organic link to our own thoughts and self-representation, and people can be exclusively more creative in mother tongue. So this is a fascinating debate actually, in terms of how do we balance between creative, self-owning, belongingness, which in a linguistic terms, but in terms of caste and class, it might actually repel against who you belong to, and therefore English becomes the alternative. So, and therefore nationalism, the kind of nationalism that we are speaking today about, is a top-down nationalism that is not aware of these nitty-gritty realities on the ground.
Thank you. Ms. Stephen, please.
Yes. Yeah, the thing is, I agree very, very strongly with what Professor Kumati is saying. And I just want to add that definitely, it's an important factor in identity. For instance, when you talk about Dalit Bahujans being very much in favor of English, it's a fact that social and educational mobility, the backwardness that they have experienced, is definitely due to the differential access to English. And in our own family, on my maternal side, my grandfather converted into a Christian mission, in 3 generations. That is, I'm the 3rd generation Christian. But in my cousins who are older to me, in a matter of less than like 14 years or so, all my cousins, my eldest aunts, 5 children are all professionally trained and live and work abroad. Compare that with what kind of mobility is available to those who don't have that kind of access. And that access came because of English. People talk, and that is because of choosing to, my grandfather chose, definitely he said, education is the reason, one of the big reasons why I have made this choice. He has articulated it, spelled it. He was also a convinced Christian who worked as an evangelist. But that was not the only thing. The other big factor was social mobility was also guaranteed if the children could study, have access to English education in the city. So there is no two ways about it. Definitely English, access to English education is a way to progress in our country. This is one of the biggest things. However, whenever we have politicians talking about language, there is an element of their own children will go abroad and study. They will go to the best institutions, have access. They'll go to Doon School and study in St. Stephen's or Mumbai University or Calcutta University. But they will always advocate, and in Karnataka, for instance, some of our best known authors were actually English professors. Ananthamurthy himself was an English professor. But then he also did not lose his touch with the mother tongue, and he has a massive body of work in both Kannada as well as in translated works in English. So I don't see it as antithetical. I myself speak and work in 4 or 5 languages quite fluently. It's an advantage we have in the South. It's no disadvantage to know a number of languages. And so I feel that trying to pin such a multifarious, like a rainbow of a culture into one language, people are really missing the boat and losing out a whole host of layered understanding. I have some more to say on this, but I will say it later. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me bring in Dr. Kothari.
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, how long do you think this compromise of 22 scheduled languages will work? As more and more people in obscure parts of the country acquire a voice through internet and social media, they will increasingly want to assert their own identity. For now, we have sort of subsumed a lot of different languages into these broad blocks of 22 languages. Just going to the example of, let's say, just Hindi itself, which we like to think of like 44% of the country, that's according to the census, speaks Hindi, but actually Hindi itself is encompassing 65 languages that were spoken in northern India. And a lot of these people, whether it's Bhojpuri speakers or Chhattisgarhi or Maithili, as they acquire their own voice, they want to express their identity. They are increasingly asking for recognition for their own language. So how long this 22 language compromise would work? What we see is, even let's say the state of Bihar, there is an increasing demand that primary education should be in the mother tongue, which is not Hindi. It is Magadhi or Chhattisgarhi or Bhojpuri or whatever. And it makes sense. That is what science also says, that primary education for children should be. And that is, if children, when they're taught in an alien language, they are less, they are less likely to absorb the concepts and more likely to drop out of studies, which is what we've seen. And Hindi, the way the standard Hindi is an alien language for these people. So we are already seeing demands, increasing demands, but as more and more people acquire a political voice, how long do you think that this 22 language thing is going to survive?
So the way you frame that question, Yajur, and you ask how long, almost like there should be an expiry date to national projects. That if we were to think of these as ongoing projects, as work in progress, we wouldn't worry too much about how long this is going to take. I mean, when the 8th schedule was drawn up, it did not have 22 languages. It acquired more languages as it went along. And I also don't feel comfortable about the use of the word obscure when you framed your question, that these people from these obscure parts, when they begin to kind of, I think the question of assertion, the question of legitimacy of one's own self is quite often manifest on the body of the language, right? It is not, the body of the language may not exhaust all the possibilities of legitimacy of the self. There may be other sources also, but it is a very, very important site. Now, really speaking, this distinction that by which we think that, oh, there are some people who, although they have a quote unquote dialect, but now they want to promote their dialect as a language, I think there is a problem even in the use of those words. I mean, historically speaking, we have not had a distinction of language and dialect. Show me Indian words that tell us there were equivalents of the language and dialect division in our linguistic history. We don't have it. You would have people saying Boli or sometimes Bhasha, but the distinction was not being made in the way that we have come to understand today. And then we have come to exceptionalize how certain quote unquote dialects have a script, don't have a script, have so many people, don't have so many people. These distinctions are actually really quite pointless. The fact is that even in a so-called dialect, there'll be lakhs and lakhs of people speaking that language in India. So if over a period of time, there are more and more people wanting recognition from the 8th schedule to be included, to be mirrored, there is no problem in that. And really speaking, even 22 languages is an artificial number. If you're looking at the People's Linguistic Survey of India that Ganesh Devi and his group organized it, it shows you there are more than 1,000 languages. Frankly, we do not have an accurate figure of the number of languages that exist in India today. And if you were to ask people who speak Bhojpuri or who speak Maithili whether they think of it as a dialect, it is not. To them, it is a language, and that is how we should recognize it. So really speaking, the question of how long will it take is an impatient one, because it actually presumes that we need to complete this project at some point. I think let's reconcile with the fact that this is work in progress. And because it is work in progress, it is so complex, which comes over so clearly from what my other colleagues have pointed out. I mean, Mithilesh used the very significant words of negotiation and code switching, which I think India's multilingualism is invites us to understand what it is to negotiate with a language. Because very often it is not as if we are speaking mutually incomprehensible languages. Quite often we also understand some parts of the languages that we deal with. When a train travels from Delhi to Bihar, it tapers. It tapers into different languages, almost like colors on a shade card. So sometimes you are going from Oshmiya to Odia to Bangla, and some syllabic changes are taking place, some pronunciations change, some accents change, but it is not as if you can't understand each other. You do understand each other because there is an important process of also some degree of mutual comprehensibility, some code switching, which has involved here. I think Cynthia has already pointed out to the complexity of region itself as a multilingual site. I mean, she gave the example of Karnataka, which is a fascinating one. Gujarat, where I come from, Gujarati got homogenized so that Kutchi and Gujaratis are not even mutually comprehensible. So the thing about India's linguistic scheme is that so-called different languages sometimes have more in common with each other, and sometimes what are lumped together as the same language may have very, very vast differences with each other. Now, given this nuance and this complexity, and also the caste and class mobility that Ajay was drawing attention to, I think we have here basically a nation that is encountering a reality that no other nation has encountered. I'm sorry for making this such an exceptional case. If at all I had to draw a parallel, I would do that only with certain South African countries. But really speaking, this degree of linguistic diversity and these competing forms of nationalisms, and to me, they are all nationalisms of their own kind and dignity. I don't think of them as regional nationalisms. I think of all of them as very legitimate forms of nationalisms, whether it is Tamil or it is Odia and so on. So given that, I think we cannot even begin to understand how we could even come up with the project of a national language. And I also want to ask this question: are the problems we face in India today, are they produced by not having a national language? I don't think that is the case. I think the problems that are produced in India are these huge forms of inequalities and many other forms of dogma, fundamentalism, caste, and they are the ones producing the problems that we are facing. We are not facing problems out of a linguistic diversity at all. So why do we want to fix what is not broken? Why would we not pay attention to what needs to be attended to issues of caste and gender? And how is a national language going to help those situations? So I feel like this is sometimes this whole idea of, oh, when we go abroad, we should have our own language, we should not speak in English. I think I agree with Cynthia that we need to understand identity and pragmatism together. I mean, this is not merely a matter of an ideological question. It is also a matter of thinking that, all right, how do we want to negotiate with each other and with the rest of the world? And I think that is an art that needs to be kind of thought about. It is at the heart of the multilingual country that this is today, where what has not been achieved by government rules has been achieved by Bollywood.
Yes, that sort of goes back to your earlier point that a common language, it would evolve over time. And I think it also kind of sits well with the fact that, like you said, a lot of identities would over time assert. So it's a work in progress. It's not 20, it wasn't 22 languages when it started. It may not be 22 languages going forward. It might be a bigger number. But a common language sort of addresses the issue of communication and interaction across lines. I do want to ask you, you said South African countries, some countries in South Africa may be good examples in terms of linguistic diversity. Do you think European Union could be a sort of model that India could look up to? We have 22 official languages, they have 24. All of them are very nationalistic about their languages, and they are sort of cooperating in a federal structure similar to India's. Do you think, well, to some extent?
So my sense is of my reading that, really speaking, even in the European Union, for instance, Basque militates against the idea of a national Spanish. The High German, the Low German, the High Dutch, the Low Dutch, Flemish versus German. There are historically placed processes of homogenization even in Europe. And there are forms of resistance even in Europe. So it is not as if we need to set up a monolingual West against a multilingual East. I think there are artificial processes by which German was created. So we need to understand that even the European Union didn't have it all sorted out. And today, when there is a conference in the European Union, although people speaking Spanish and Portuguese completely understand each other, they will wait for the respective translators to come into that conference to begin that conference. You need to have that last translator from Estonia to join the conference to be able to have that conversation. Why do they do that? It's not as if they don't understand each other, but because this idea of language plus nation is sort of being treated in such an earnest manner, almost to a point of being ridiculous sometimes, that I don't think that is a model that should work for us. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, what happens in the Indian parliament? Do people who don't speak Hindi, are they at a special disadvantage when they cannot speak Hindi? Does the parliament make room for those people to speak in Tamil or to speak in Odia and have translators and interpreters who can translate that? The very fact that we are having this conversation today in English and all of us come from different parts of the country is already a telling example that this is how we negotiate, that sometimes we do this, sometimes we do that. And I think if there is a certain degree of chaos and anarchy to it, so be it.
Sure. Actually, it's interesting. So there's an interesting observation that even in the European Parliament, despite the fact that they go through this whole process of 24 languages and translators and everything, English tends to get most of the airtime in their discussions, and English not being one of the members anymore. So it's actually interesting because even in their model, English ends up becoming the de facto official language, but it's never recognized as such. And seems to be in India. In India, it does get recognition as a co-official language, but it's serving pretty much as the de facto official language. In old times, people in different parts of the country had much less to interact with the national government. That's changing now. In old times, most of the interaction was with local governments. But as we are coming up with more and more national schemes, be it Aadhaar and others and national level exams, people have to interact with the union government much more. The union government tends to do most of this work in English and Hindi. And this has already become a complaint often cited from various parts of India, where there are many people who don't understand Hindi and don't even understand English, and they are struggling already. And this is something which was not a problem probably experienced 20 years ago, but it's going to become more and more as the systems get integrated and everything. So what is the solution to that? Do we need to invest more resources into at least making sure everybody speaks English as a second or a third language? Or otherwise the government invests more in making everything available in multiple languages, cooperates with the states to make sure at least all the official state languages are there, which is clearly not the case at the moment.
So I will briefly respond to you, Yajur, and then I must allow my other colleagues to speak. I've taken too much time already. I think a very, very interesting illustration from recent times would be the vaccination drive, right? And what was happening when people were registering for vaccination, and what was happening when people had vaccination cynicism. How were these dialogues and these conversations happening? And of whatever little I have managed to follow, my sense is that once again, on the ground, very often, volunteers were taking decisions depending on the situations they found themselves in. So for instance, some of the work that I have done in villages that touch the Indo-Pakistan border in Kutch, there are people there who were speaking Kutchi Sindhi to persuade people to take vaccination. Now, surely this was not part of any major planning, right? The planning would have been to have Hindi, English, and perhaps at the state level, it would have been Gujarati. But the fact is that this was neither of the three languages. This was an entirely different language by which volunteers were managing to do it. So the very fact that we have managed to come to the kind of mark of vaccination that we have already tells you that there must have been a series of negotiations that would have gone on the ground in different languages. What exactly happened, we don't quite know. But all I'm saying is we cannot, these are not matters only for the state to decide for us. In fact, we would be in trouble if we were to consign these matters to the state. The less the state does, the better we would be.
Okay, thank you. But in terms of examinations, I think when it comes to national examinations dealing with state institutions, we have to rely on the goodwill of some staff or somebody to help people. Otherwise, we are putting them at a disadvantage. People like myself, for example, who is fluent in Hindi and English, I do feel that I tend to have a huge privilege over a lot of my compatriots.
So maybe someone else.
Okay. Yes, I want to bring in Dr. Raman, please, sir.
To make about 2 or 3 very quick points, some of it related to what was already said. First of all, as a country, we need to think rationally and not emotionally. And I think a lot of this language debate gets mired more in emotion than reason. So if we look at objectively, what would be the language that would most enable us to do well in life, whether it is in terms of education, whether in terms of jobs, whatever. So I think the bottom line has to be that, more than, while it's perfectly acceptable for people to learn multiple languages, it is most welcome. But when we look at this entire concept, it has to be with the background or with the foundation as to what is going to be in the best interest of the people in terms of improving their life. Now, that is one point that we need to make. The second, and I think a very, very important point, which keeps getting missed out, is that in a state like Tamil Nadu, where we have seen anti-Hindi protests, people have lost their lives in the anti-Hindi protest over the decades. The point is, there is an all-pervasive hypocrisy, which one of the panelists actually referred to. So the politicians will go out there and say that all schools should become only Tamil medium and Tamil should be the medium of instruction. And you will find that they have put their kids in the best possible English medium schools. So this hypocrisy needs to be called out. In fact, I have been on multiple television shows where I've actually called this out, where this dichotomy, politicians calling for that circulars should not be sent in Hindi at all, often run Hindi schools, schools teaching Hindi in Tamil Nadu. So I think that there is this, and I'm sure that the same extends in other states. I know for a fact that it does extend to Karnataka as well, and possibly many of the other states. So this kind of chauvinism, this kind of hypocrisy, this kind of double standard is done purely to raise emotions, purely to raise passions, and for hopefully electoral dividends. So if, obviously the electoral dividends in many states is not there anymore with this. My last point, and I think that this is very, very important, much effort has been made in trying to spread regional language communication, regional language websites, regional language usage on the internet, right? On social media, on the internet, and so on. But if you take a state like Tamil Nadu, for instance, and I use this example repeatedly simply because Tamil Nadu is the state which has stood up on the language issue possibly the most among the states. And what we have found, and this is something that I actually did an informal kind of a study a few years ago, we found that the English language skills of the average youngster in Tamil Nadu has dramatically improved after the mobile phone became ubiquitous. If anything, the youngster in the village is more interested in using English as the medium now to speak and communicate than he is in using his own mother tongue. So this is something which is fascinating because the entire expectation was, we will have millions and millions of vernacular sites, websites in the various languages. All the apps would be in the various languages. And then we actually found out that many of the people whom we anticipated would be using the regional language apps were ending up using the apps in English. They were struggling initially, they were feeling their way through, but they were determined that they would use it. E-commerce, e-government related activities, e-commerce, I mean, the villages in my state where people order on Amazon and Flipkart is not funny. These are village kids who have figured out the entire process of on Amazon and Flipkart in English. So they have read, they have studied in Tamil medium schools. So I think we have to understand that whether government does anything or not, there are things happening on the ground, and English in some states for sure has dramatically taken a leap over the local languages in terms of acceptability and in terms of usage.
Very quick question. Are we by any chance falling into the elitist trap here? Like, one of the main criticisms to the Constituent Assembly of India was that this was a group of privileged people who had ended up having discussions for the whole country, and they were a bit disconnected with the real masses out there for whom a lot of these things. I'm just wondering if this something like that. Obviously, you're talking about Tamil Nadu, which is one of the most literate states in the country, but the vast majority of the
see, again, we cannot look at a one-size-fits-all kind of an example. I'll tell you, today, possibly a state like Tamil Nadu, again, would probably have, I don't know, I mean, officially the numbers may be 40% English literate or 50% or whatever. But practically on the ground, I would say 90% of the population. That means includes people in rural areas. I'm talking predominantly because the city folks, had it even earlier. They had a certain basic exposure to English, but in villages, and that I correlate very strongly with the smartphone, which has gone into every hand. Every child, every youngster in the village today communicates in English. They will send you WhatsApp in the most ungrammatical English, but they will still do it. They will manage to make themselves understood. So and they see that as a kind of a matter of pride, because they're not country bumpkins who speak the vernacular language alone, which is how they perceive themselves. And therefore, this kind of a dominance of English has happened on the ground. I know that it may not be the case in rural Bihar or in rural Uttar Pradesh or in rural Chhattisgarh, but certainly among the more literate developed states, I know for a fact, I can tell you for sure, Kerala, the usage of English is huge now in the last few years. Karnataka, to a sizable extent, at least I know for a fact, because I've toured extensively in the southern part of Karnataka. I don't have that much knowledge of northernmost parts of Karnataka, but I'm just giving an example. So there is something, this debate itself may end up becoming irrelevant in 10 years' time, because events may have overtaken us.
Let me bring to note a few things here. So even in the Constituent Assembly, when these debates happened and they were very contentious, it was generally the representatives from the same states that you mentioned, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, I guess, or their predecessor states, who were the most vocal in making a case for English to be the official language, not Hindi. So even 75 years ago, that was the view coming from the South, whereas there were these people from some of the northern states who were the biggest vocal supporters of having Hindi as the official language. And obviously we know the compromise that was reached. And I think at the time also, the hope was that over time, this question would become irrelevant. But now with the current government, this question has been put back into the spotlight, and we are seeing a
unfortunately
effort. Yes.
I mean, again, it comes back to political, it comes back to politics. They want to harvest votes in one part of the country. Everything is one nation, one language, one nation, one identity, one nation, one card, whatever.
Agreed. So there is definitely political inclinations are always there, but let's assume they're not there, and let's see if there is a legitimate case there that we might be overlooking. So if you talk about English making a lot of economic rationale as a language, as well as it's becoming the language of social mobility, which is absolutely true. But that's not just true for India. It's true for all over the world, maybe except China. So even Koreans are learning English. Germans are learning English. When you go to an MBA school in France today, you'll do your MBA in English. You don't do it in French anymore, at least in the good ones. So that applies all over the world which was not even impacted by colonization.
Well, one quick point. You said China. I used to visit China very often. And I'll tell you, until 8 years, 9 years ago, there was a huge move towards learning English as well. Now, after Xi Jinping came in, that has been slowed down a little bit. But before that, I know for a fact that, Chinese parents used to literally die to have their kids learn English. So there was a big movement. And even now, a very sizable portion of the quote unquote Chinese elite does speak English.
Yeah, I agree with you. So the point being that if you are an open economy, and India has been opening up over the last few decades and globally connected, English is going to serve as the means of social mobility and economic rationale, regardless of your colonial history. But still, most countries do have a lot of symbolic importance to a national language, whether we look at any of the countries in the Middle East or Europe. So now I want to address the question of the emotional aspect you mentioned. Like, are we just dismissing the emotions of these people? And is it prudent because these emotions have not subsided over 75 years? There is clearly a demographics in the country where these emotions resonate. Yes, the politicians are probably instigating certain reactions and stoking those emotions, but they're not creating them. Those emotions have persisted. So going back to the first thing that you said, that I'm happy to have a national language for symbolic purposes, as long as it's not a spoken language, modern spoken Indian language. Do you think, like, if Europe had to choose Latin, we could choose something like Sanskrit, and would that be acceptable for the whole country?
No.
As a national language?
Look, purely from a perspective of historic origin, that may have been thinkable at one point, but this is completely ruled out now, simply because Sanskrit is now associated with Hindutva, and for that reason, Sanskrit is a non-starter in terms of being accepted as a national language, because very clearly it symbolizes a particular identity, a particular religion, and a particular movement, which is anathema to a large segment of the country. So there's no way that Sanskrit, purely from historicity, from the merit of the language, maybe, but clearly from a practical political perspective, it is simply ruled out because of the identity that Sanskrit has now got, that even giving grants in universities for furthering the study of Sanskrit is now seen as a pro-Hindutva line or measure in many ways. It's not really linked just as a language promotion method.
Correct. I mean, I agree with you. And that's in the current political discourse, but it's also the language very closely associated with Mahatma Gandhi and with former greater figures of India. So we can't exactly let one political party appropriate a language that we've had as a civilizational pride, as along with Tamil and other languages. But there is an aspirational value. What I'm saying is India's had some legitimate aspirations to have its language recognized on international platforms, and this is widespread. It's not just in the Hindutva circle. It's something that, having lived as an expat for many years, I have interacted with many expats in the UK, US, and East Asia, and there is a feeling that why is United Nations not having one of the languages of India as an official language when we are the second largest nation in the world? But then which language is it? I think the previous governments made a case for Bengali. BJP tried to make a case for Hindi. I would probably be indifferent if it's any Indian language. But to see that recognition, when people open an Apple product, it's there in like 14 languages, but no Indian language is there.
Just again, emotion over reason, creating internal discord or in my opinion, preventing internal discord, having greater harmony in the country, to me is far, far more important than, quote unquote, some kind of international recognition for whatever it may count. And I think that, look, at the end of the day, international recognition comes from economic clout and nothing else. Why? What about the status of China? I mean, today, the almost all senior Chinese officials conduct their press conferences in Chinese. Nobody gives. They still get the attention. That's because of who they are, what kind of economic might they have, what kind of military might they have, and it all comes down to money. So I don't see this. Again, we are getting drawn back into the emotional aspect. It's great if we had a language which was recognized by the United Nations. All of that is fine. But practically, if adopting or such a language is going to create disharmony within the country, disaffection within segments of the population, I clearly don't see it as being worth the price that has to be paid. So I would be much rather happier with a population that is very contented, doing their own thing, voluntarily learning multiple languages. The Hindi Prachar Sabha in Chennai, for your information, has among the highest number of candidates studying Hindi across the country in terms of the Hindi Prachar Sabhas that are there in the various states. So a state which is ostensibly hostile to Hindi has huge numbers of people learning Hindi. So I think that is the key. As long as something is not thrust down my throat, I have no problem learning the language, and people will find their way. If the person in Orissa finds it useful to learn Malayalam, he will learn it. If at all at some stage it's going to improve his economic prospects or his quality of life. So I think that we should let things lie. Government need not poke its nose into every single aspect of what should we eat, what should we wear, what language we should speak. I think the disappointing thing is this government came in with the promise of less government, more governance. And sadly, 7 years down the line, we are pretty much on the opposite end of the spectrum with less governance and more government.
Yeah, just to summarize. If I may just add one point to the question you raised to Sumant earlier. I mean, symbols need to be consensually produced. Symbols cannot be meaningful for some constituencies and represent either no meaning or alienation for some others. What does Sanskrit mean for a Mizo? What does Sanskrit mean for a Dalit? A language that was even denied to a Dalit. So really speaking, Sanskrit is not some universal symbol that works for everybody. In fact, there can be a fair amount of hostility towards it for the historical role that it has played for certain constituencies. So symbols they don't sort of fall from the skies. They need to be consensually produced in which can mirror then multiple interests. And we don't have too many of those symbols.
But we have precedents of adopting symbols, for example, adopting Rabindranath Tagore's Jana Gana Mana as a national anthem. I don't think anybody has ever objected to it. A lot of people probably don't understand it. But as a nation, we take pride, and we take pride in the fact that this beautiful language of Bengali is part of our nation. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the fact that Tamil symbols, Chola symbols of Nataraj and all, they have been adopted by the whole nation as sort of what signifies India abroad, any Indian embassy and everything. The Chola Nataraj is kind of the sort of, we look at that and we're like, okay, this is India being represented here. Although it has nothing to do for example, a Punjabi, where there is no history related to that, the bronze Cholas. So I'm just trying to think, would it be, so the point Dr. Raman was making was that as long as any language is not elevated to a status above the other Indian languages, there will be harmony. But if once you start elevating one above the others, that's when there is a risk of harmony, showing disharmony. And he talked about education, which is sort of like being adopted because it's voluntarily being given in of Hindi, at least in now. So we're running out of time. Let's wrap up on the question of education very quickly. I want some quick remarks on education. So the three language formula that India adopted back in 1968. I want to get a lot of people. There are very polarizing views on that. Some people consider it a complete failure, while others think that it's something that we really need to stick to, and that is the only way going forward for India. I just want to get your quick remarks on that formula and how it has played out, or if you think there is room for it to be reformed.
I think it had its merit. I think it certainly had its merit. It instituted a process by which people had to learn these multiple languages, and to think of language of the state and language of a more kind of centrist language, a language of the state, and English, to learn all of it together. I mean, I feel like, as someone who speaks Hindi, Gujarati, Kutchi, and many other languages of Western and Northern India, I would have done well by having a system by which I could have learned Tamil. You know, it would have been very enriching.
But that doesn't happen, right? We never get that option in Northern India to learn Tamil. It's never there in the three language formula. If anything, you get Sanskrit or some foreign language, but there is no question of getting Oriya or Dr. Jha.
Yeah, thanks, Yajur. I share my views with what Professor Kothari has expressed. This three language formula has a merit, and although the implementation, as you have said, that in North India we do not get the chance to learn, say, any of the South Indian language, but moving forward, I think we should in fact create opportunity to say bring Maithili speaker should read directly from Kannada or Malayalam, rather than through a third language, be it Hindi or English. So that connects to the question of, say, a lot of things has been said about emotion and reason, and we need to be pragmatic or rational. But I don't think when we talk about any form of collective identity or national symbol, we can keep emotion outside of it or passion outside of it. I mean, you have to give certain merit to the way people feel about their language, their culture, their identity. So in India, if you look at even the linguistic economy, even if all Indians learn English, we will not have egalitarian society. I mean, there are economic side of linguistic debate. There are question of opportunity, but to have a society which provide equality of opportunity, equality of status, not just to the individual, but also to their culture, to their language, their tradition, their identity, you need to think about a larger democratic process. And in that, I think, just a binary between rationality or emotion or being pragmatic and, just reducing linguistic debate to the question of how politicians screwed us by sending their kids to the foreign university and not doing nothing, just a kind of electoral vote bank politics. We need to, give a serious thought to the linguistic hierarchy that exists. At the top, you have English, but bilingual Hindi and regional language. But below regional language, also there are, like Tulu, Maithili, and many others, constantly trying to negotiate this linguistic hierarchy. I would also like to add one point which is said about the caste, class, and gender thing when we talk about the language. So many Dalits feel that English has certain liberatory potential. And I agree with that, because various provincial languages do have within them a degree of hierarchy, right? The caste domination or maybe class domination within, say, Tamil or Maithili or Hindi, so to say. There is no denial of that. But my point is that you cannot fight, say, caste hierarchy or gender hierarchy just by adopting English. The real struggle for creating a egalitarian society, or a society where there is no caste discrimination, has to be fought in the various provincial public sphere, deeply embedded in the dominant languages. So these Bhasa sphere and their democratic struggle need to be given a little more credit than just about having a kind of all India perspective through Hindi or English or any other kind of languages. So, there are various challenges when it comes to language issue, and we cannot reduce it merely to the question of economic opportunity. And there are, the organic way of developing a language of communication. In India, English and Hindi are by and large, at least comprehensible by the majority of the population, if not all. So there are organic way of those modes of communication developing. So within South, you have, different linguistic communities speaking or mutually understanding each other. In, say, I am living in the eastern part, I speak Maithili, but I can well understand Bengali, Uriya, or Assamese. So there are just smaller things. So those natural, organic way of developing a lingua franca is already on its way. So, I go back to my earlier point that this three language formula, and more than that, its implementation will certainly help bring the Indians psychologically and emotionally together, and it matters, not just the economic and the rational side of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jha. Dr. Gudavarti.
Yeah, I would only add, I think much ground has been covered. So only that the language question we need to therefore discuss in today's context, which is partly, I think, where the nation state itself is under stress. So on one hand, where there is economic globalization, there is erosion of political sovereignty, and therefore there's much stress on cultural nationalism. And that's where the language question is getting fixed in terms of this hyper claims and, this question of unification, this question of singularity, and all of them become. That's on one hand, that's one challenge. The other is, while I agree with the spirit in which Professor Kothari organized, that question of fluidity, that we need multiplicity, we need certain amount of chaos, which is what we are moving to. I think education also spreading down all the way to all the castes, especially in the Indian context, has added to that chaos and their multiplicity. But with a note of caution that it is that kind of a fluidity, that kind of a lateral spread of politics of difference, which has also led to a certain kind of a consent for authoritarianism. That endless spread of chaos has also somewhere led to what critical theorist Badiou says, an urge for false concreteness. That we all need something tangible, something very concrete, and that's where I think the right-wing politics. So while I agree with the spirit of it, that chaos is necessary for that kind of an accommodation to push back, hyper nationalist projects, but that kind of a chaos can also lead to a consent for false concreteness, mega state forms, forms of governance which are very authoritarian. So I think our challenge really in discussing questions like language, therefore, are very important because they create a certain kind of a life world. So how do we create that sense of belonging, some sense of concreteness we all require, in terms of community and belongingness as we spread? I think that's the real challenge, and that's something that we might want to think along in course of in this very globalized times where most communities are struggling to cope with globalization. Even in advanced capitalist countries like Europe, most communities are very provincial. They do not want to Welsh or Scottish, do not want to move away from into metropolitan. They want to retain the local culture. But then you are being pushed a global economic project. So how do we then, kind of gauge these two things? I think is the real challenge. Even the linguistic question is undergoing that kind of a complexity in the current times.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Dr. Raman. Actually, because I had asked about the three language formula, but since you have insights on Tamil Nadu, it would be interesting because they never adopted the three language formula, right? It's two language formula there. So
yeah,
quite interesting.
And I think that one of the reasons why English got so much prominence is also the fact that we did not embrace the three-language formula. And even now, under the new education policy, the Tamil Nadu government has made it very clear. Both the previous ruling government and the present government have been categorical in saying that the state will not accept the three-language policy. So there is a, if you remember, the new education policy initial draft actually said Hindi will be compulsory as the third language for states which are non-native Hindi speakers. And after there was a huge hue and cry, that clause was changed to any language can be the third language. So I think that these are seen extremely suspiciously. When they are attempted, when such attempts are made to ram down a language down people's throats, railway exams are held in. I'll give you an example. There is a postal exam to recruit postmen who will work within the state, right? And the exam can be only in Hindi or English. Now, how absurd is that? I mean, I can understand it if it is a national, if it's a job across the country, and then one understands the logic behind it. But to work within Tamil Nadu, in one district as a postman, why should the exam be in Hindi and English? So there are, I could go on and on and on. Even the NEET exam initially, we did not have the option of having it in a language like Tamil. So I mean, there is a continuous. I don't know whether the government does it knowingly or it's just indifferent. I don't know what it is, but to somebody who's hardly a chauvinist on this particular area, I too find it extremely strange that the government makes attempt after attempt to impose Hindi on states that don't want it.
Yeah, you're right. Successive national governments have taken it as their duty to promote Hindi across the nation, and that's how they've interpreted their directions in the constitution. Ms. Stephen, I think you bring another perspective. For Karnataka, the three-language policy is very contentious there. So maybe you can give some insights. Until now, some of the people have favored. Dr. Raman said it's not there in Tamil Nadu, which has actually worked to the advantage of Tamil Nadu in terms of English adoption. I would like to get your insight on, especially with Karnataka's case.
Yeah, it's very interesting in Karnataka because we have all had the three-language formula being quite strongly followed here for many, many decades. And I think it's a good move. But my question is, why is that? What three-language formula is followed in UP? I want to know. What is that third language they're being taught other than Hindi and English? In UP, what is the third language that is being taught? That's what I would like to know. In South India, it makes sense. In Gujarat and Maharashtra, it makes sense to be taught, even though those are sort of Devanagari type scripts, it makes sense. What is that is one. And secondly, there is also, my children studied both in state board as well as in ICSE. And I know that also it's there in CBSE that you can offer French for your 11th and 12th standard, and even in 10th, you can offer French because of this language, three-language formula. You can take up any other language. So a lot of, and some people pick up Sanskrit, which is also important, which is also an option, because they say that it's a scoring subject, they can get more marks in Sanskrit. Some people feel that it's easy to score in Sanskrit. So, if it's really a matter of promoting national integration, through promoting the learning of languages, I would suggest that instead of Hindi being forcing non-Hindi states to study Hindi anyway, Hindi has a hegemonic presence in the Hindi belt in the North Indian states. So I feel if they're really sincere about promoting national integration, the center needs, through its CBSE and, through the ICSE syllabuses, the state syllabus, there is a need for people to study other languages. Definitely, I think people in UP would benefit from studying, for instance, Bangla, which is a border. West Bengal has a border with UP, I believe. And it would be important for for all of us to be a more integrated country to talk. And if it's a hegemonic, if it contains one of these two so-called official language hegemonies, then they should go for studying Gujarati or Marathi. What is the problem? What is that? That's what I would like to know. Can any of my panelists, fellow co-panelists, respond to this question? What is a third language that is being taught, for instance, say in UP, Chhattisgarh? What third language is being taught? That's what I'd like to know.
I can only tell you about Delhi. For me, the options were Sanskrit or some of the foreign languages like French, German, Russian.
Exactly. So that is exactly, that is my point. So if they are so interested in national integration, offer Gujarati, Marathi, Punjabi.
Absolutely. I think if I had the option of learning Urdu or Bengali or something, I would have definitely embraced it. And I completely agree with all of you. It makes sense for Indians, a country which has so many languages, for the children to be multilingual. It perfectly makes sense. This was a wonderful debate. We went over time, but it was really interesting discussion. I've been playing devil's advocate. So please, we don't, as a platform, Argumentative Indians, we are not an advocacy platform. We are not making a case for a national language, but we like to bring out different topics which are part of the debate in public discourse and get well-informed perspectives on these matters. So thank you all of us for joining and for this very enlightening discussion. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.